On September 25, 1066, a Norwegian invasion army stood near Stamford Bridge in northern England. Many of its men separated from the armor they had left beside their ships. Their commander was Harald Sigurdsson, Harald Hardrada, a Christian king, a former mercenary of the Byzantine emperor, and perhaps the last Scandinavian ruler to attempt a conquest in the old Viking tradition. By sunset, Harald was dead. So was his English ally, Tostig Godwinson. Contemporary accounts cannot tell us exactly how many Norwegians fell, but later tradition claimed that a fleet of hundreds required only a few dozen ships to carry the survivors home. This battle is often called the end of the Viking Age. But the warriors did not simply disappear. Some returned to farms, now governed by Christian law. Others entered royal armies, exchanged the longship for the knight's horse, or sailed east to guard the emperors of Constantinople. Their descendants became Norman conquerors, Irish townsmen, Russian elites, crusaders, and Christian kings. So what actually happened to the Viking warriors when the world that had created them ceased to exist? The first problem is the word Viking. Vikings were not a single nation, tribe, or permanent military order. The Old Norse term, associated with going Viking, described an activity, an armed maritime expedition rather, than the name of every Scandinavian person. Most inhabitants of Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Iceland, and the Norse colonies were farmers, craftspeople, traders, fishers, servants, or enslaved laborers. A man might farm during one part of his life and join a raiding or trading voyage during another. Successful leaders assembled temporary fleets through family connections, promises of profit, political alliances, and personal reputation. Kings and chieftains maintained smaller groups of professional retainers, but the enormous permanent Viking armies imagined in popular culture did not exist across Scandinavia as a unified institution. What made these warriors so dangerous was not religious fanaticism. Their effectiveness came from mobility, adaptable leadership, maritime experience, and their ability to strike where organized resistance was weak. Longships could cross open water, but also travel through shallow rivers. This allowed Scandinavian forces to attack monasteries, trading centers, estates, and towns before defenders could concentrate. Crews could raid, trade, demand tribute, accept payment as mercenaries, or settle permanently. The boundary between commerce and violence was often thin. Prestige rested on success. A leader who returned with silver, weapons, enslaved people, and stories of victory could attract more followers. Warriors expected gifts from their lord. Rings, armlets, swords, feasting, and public generosity bound a fighting household together. Religion reinforced this world without mechanically causing it. Norse communities honored numerous gods and local supernatural powers. Odin was associated with rulership, poetry, knowledge, and war. Thor with protection and strength. Freya with fertility and prosperity. Beliefs varied between places, and much of what is now called Norse mythology was preserved in manuscripts, written by Christians centuries later. Death in battle could be honored, but not every Scandinavian warrior expected Valhalla, and not every Viking expedition was a sacred war. Wealth, land, political advantage, revenge, and reputation were more immediate motives. Yet the old religion was woven into authority. Chieftains sponsored sacrifices and feasts. Elite burials displayed rank through ships, weapons, animals, jewelry, and grave goods. Oaths, assemblies, family loyalties, and vengeance helped regulate societies in which centralized government remained limited. Christianization threatened more than a collection of gods. It altered burial, marriage, law, kingship, literacy, political legitimacy, and the relationship between a warrior and his ruler. That was why the Viking world's destruction would not come from one battlefield. It would come when its own kings discovered that Christianity could help them build something more powerful than the raiding society they were replacing. Christianity was not new to the Scandinavians when their rulers officially adopted it. Viking travelers had encountered Christian societies from Ireland to the Byzantine Empire. Scandinavian settlers lived among Christian populations in England, Francia, and Ireland. Traders visiting Christian ports could accept baptism or a preliminary Christian blessing because it improved their legal and commercial position without necessarily requiring an immediate rejection of every older practice. Missionaries also traveled north. Ansgar preached at the Swedish trading center of Birka during the 9th century. Although his mission did not transform Sweden at once, churches appeared in commercial centers where foreign merchants and local converts needed them. Archaeology archaeology reveals a long period of coexistence. Christian crosses and Thor's hammer pendants circulated at the same time, sometimes produced in the same workshops. The decisive change came when Scandinavian kings recognized Christianity as a political system. A pagan ruler could dominate a region through family alliances, victory, wealth, and ritual leadership. A Christian king could add something more: recognition from other Christian monarchs, bishops who supported royal authority, clergy who kept written records, and a universal religion that could weaken the independence of local cults. Denmark moved first. Harold Bluetooth's Great Jelling Stone, raised in the 10th century, declares that he won Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. The inscription was a royal claim, not evidence that every Dane changed belief on a particular day. Conversion had begun earlier and continued after Harold's reign, but the monument announced that Christianity had become part of Danish kingship. Norway's conversion was more violent and politically contested. Olaf Tryggvason, who became king in 995, promoted Christianity aggressively. Later saga accounts describe coercion, executions, hostage-taking, and the destruction of pagan images. These stories were written long afterward, and their dramatic details cannot always be verified. But there is little doubt that conversion was entangled with Olaf's effort to force regional chieftains under royal control. Olaf disappeared after his defeat at the Battle of Svolder in 1000. Christianity did not disappear with him. Olaf Haraldsson, later Saint Olaf, continued the consolidation. After becoming king of Norway in 1015, he supported Christian law and fought powerful regional opponents. Yet the conflict was not simply Christians against pagans. Many of Olaf's enemies were already Christian or willing to accept the new religion. They resisted his taxes, punishments, royal officials, and attacks on local autonomy. Driven into exile, Olaf returned in 1030 and was killed at Stiklestad by a coalition of Norwegian opponents. His death might have ended his political project. Instead, reports of miracles developed around his body, and he was soon revered as a saint. The defeated king became more useful dead than he had been alive. His cult gave Norway a native Christian patron whose holiness supported the monarchy. Warriors who had fought against Olaf could accept a Christian kingdom without admitting that they had surrendered to a foreign religion. Christianity was no longer merely the faith of German missionaries or English priests. It possessed a Scandinavian royal martyr. Iceland followed a different path. Around the year 1000, growing tension between Christian and pagan factions threatened the unity of the Icelandic Commonwealth. At the Althing, the law speaker Thorgeir was entrusted with proposing a settlement. According to the later account in the Book of the Icelanders, he decided that Iceland should formally become Christian, while certain pagan practices could temporarily continue in private. Whatever its exact details, the settlement demonstrated that conversion could occur through law and political compromise rather than conquest. Sweden changed more slowly. King Olof Skotkonung was baptized around the beginning of the 11th century, but royal conversion did not immediately eliminate pagan practice. Different regions adopted Christianity at different speeds, and church organization became firmly established only over generations. By then, another transformation was already underway. Scandinavian rulers were replacing independent raiding coalitions with kingdoms, capable of collecting taxes, minting coins, enforcing law, and mobilizing royal armies. European defenses had also improved. Fortified bridges, defended towns, organized naval responses, and stronger monarchies made small raids increasingly dangerous. The Viking warrior now faced a choice. He could remain loyal to the older gods and risk exclusion from royal favor. He could accept baptism and continue fighting for a Christian king. He could seek employment abroad, or he could abandon the seasonal expedition and become a landholder inside the new order. The conversion did not disarm the North. It changed who could legitimately command its weapons. There was no decree abolishing Vikings and no final pagan army that surrendered to a united Christian Europe. The closest thing to a final act came in 1066, long after Scandinavian kings had themselves become Christian. Harald Hardrada represented both the old world and the new. As a young man, he fought at Stiklestad in the army of his half-brother Olaf Haraldsson. After Olaf's defeat, Harold escaped eastward. He travelled through the lands of the Rus and entered Byzantine service, becoming associated with the Varangian Guard, the emperor's elite force famous for recruiting Scandinavians and later Anglo-Saxons. Later saga traditions credit Harold with campaigns across the Mediterranean and Near East. Some details are difficult to verify, but Byzantine and Scandinavian evidence confirms that northern warriors could build fortunes and reputations in imperial service. Harold eventually returned to Scandinavia, shared the Norwegian kingship, then ruled alone. He was Christian, minted coins, and governed a kingdom. Yet his political ambition still followed the northern tradition of dynastic claims enforced by sea power. In 1066, the death of Edward the Confessor produced a struggle for the English throne. Harold Godwinson became king, but he faced two major invaders, Duke William of Normandy in the south and Harold Hardrada in the north. Hardrada allied with Harold Godwinson's exiled brother Tostig. Their fleet landed in northern England and defeated the forces of Earls Edwin and Morcar at Fulford on September 20th. 5 days later, the Norwegian army gathered near Stamford Bridge, apparently expecting the delivery of hostages and supplies from York. King Harold Godwinson had marched north with remarkable speed. His arrival surprised the invaders, some of whom had left their mail armor with the ships because of the warm weather. The exact details are obscured by conflicting and later sources. The famous story of a lone Norwegian axeman holding the bridge may be legend. What is clear is that the English crossed the River Derwent and forced a major battle. Hardrada was killed, traditionally by an arrow in the throat. Tostig refused an opportunity to abandon the alliance and also died. Reinforcements arrived from the Norwegian ships under Eystein Ore, but they had hurried so quickly that many were exhausted before entering combat. The counterattack failed. The scale of the disaster entered historical memory through the story that only 24 ships were needed to take the survivors home from a fleet, originally numbering hundreds. The figure should not be treated as a precise casualty register, but it captures how contemporaries remembered the destruction. Harold Godwinson allowed Hardrada's son Olaf and the surviving Norwegians to depart after giving assurances of peace. There was no mass conversion imposed upon them. They were already the subjects of a Christian kingdom. 3 days after Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy landed in southern England. The exhausted English king marched south and died at Hastings on October 14th. This produced one of the great ironies of the Viking aftermath. The Norwegians had failed in what is remembered as the last major Viking invasion of England. But England was then conquered by the Normans, descendants of Scandinavian settlers who had adopted French language, Christian institutions, cavalry warfare, and continental aristocratic culture. The Viking did not lose to a completely foreign world. One branch of his legacy had been defeated by another branch that had transformed more successfully. For the survivors of Stamford Bridge, however, that distinction offered little comfort. They returned without their king, without promised English land, and without the wealth expected from victory. Norway now faced a succession. While families across the kingdom had lost men, weapons, ships, and investments, the age of large Scandinavian conquests in Western Europe was ending, but thousands of trained warriors remained alive. Their skills had not become obsolete overnight. What changed was the market for those skills. Harald Hardrada's son Magnus became king in Norway. His brother Olaf, who had survived the English expedition, returned the following year and shared power with him. After Magnus died in 1069, Olaf ruled alone until 1093. He became known as Olaf Kyrre, Olaf the Peaceful. The title suggests the scale of the change. Norway did not cease fighting, but Olaf's reign was remembered for domestic consolidation rather than spectacular overseas conquest. Episcopal organization developed, royal government strengthened, and urban centers expanded. Bergen's traditional foundation is associated with his reign. Although the settlement's growth was gradual, the warriors who returned from England were not prosecuted as members of a forbidden class. They were absorbed into Norwegian society, Some remained royal retainers, others returned to family estates or local disputes. Men who had expected land in England had to seek advancement at home or elsewhere. Christianity also changed how their dead were treated. Earlier elite funerals could involve cremation, burial mounds, ships, sacrificed animals, weapons, food, and other grave goods. Christian burial generally placed the body in consecrated ground, without the same public display of personal equipment. This did not mean families instantly discarded every inherited custom. Archaeology reveals mixed practices and transitional graves. A sword might bear a cross while retaining artistic traditions rooted in the pre-Christian North. Runestones continued to honor the dead, but their inscriptions increasingly included crosses and prayers for the soul. The warrior's family now invested more visibly in churches, memorial stones, land donations, and prayers. A man's social memory could be preserved not by placing his sword beside his body, but by endowing an institution that claimed to assist his soul. The church also altered marriage and inheritance. Christian teaching opposed practices such as polygyny, concubinage, close-kin marriage, and the exposure of infants. Although the enforcement of these standards varied, clergy sought to regulate sexuality and make marriage more stable and publicly recognized. For elite warriors, this could reshape alliances. A Christian marriage blessed by the church carried legal and diplomatic value. Legitimate descent mattered to succession. Kings who once maintained several competing family connections came under pressure to define lawful wives and heirs. Women did not simply become passive observers of conversion. Elite women sponsored churches, encouraged baptism, commissioned monuments, and transmitted property. In Scandinavian settlements abroad, marriage to Christian women had already drawn warrior households into local religious networks. A raider might arrive as an outsider, but his children could grow up speaking the local language, attending church, and inheriting land through their mother. The enslaved faced a more ambiguous transformation. Viking warfare had supported an extensive trade in captives. Christian authorities discouraged the enslavement of fellow Christians and sometimes redeemed captives. But Christianity did not abolish slavery in medieval Scandinavia. Unfree labor persisted, and Christian warriors continued to take prisoners. What changed was the legal and moral framework. As more neighboring populations became Christian, raiding them created greater political and ecclesiastical problems. A Scandinavian king seeking recognition from the Pope or alliance with another Christian ruler could not treat every church and coastal settlement as a legitimate target. Royal authority also reduced the independence of local war leaders. Conversion laws were often laws of centralization. Kings and bishops defined holy days, burial rules, marriage, fasting, and church payments. Royal officials punished violations. Local chieftains who once controlled sacrifices and feasts lost an important source of authority. Some pagan practices went underground or survived as custom. Amulets, charms, protective rituals, and stories about older beings did not vanish merely because a church appeared. Yet organized public worship became increasingly difficult when royal law treated it as forbidden. This left the openly pagan warrior with shrinking options. He might submit, migrate to a region where the old religion remained stronger, or resist the king and be branded not simply a religious dissenter, but a political enemy. Our sources emphasize kings and dramatic conversions, making the experiences of ordinary warriors difficult to recover. There was probably no standard moment when a veteran placed aside Thor's hammer and accepted a cross with complete theological understanding. Conversion was often communal. If a household head, patron, or king was baptized, his dependents could follow because their security depended on him. For many men, the practical continuity was stronger than the religious rupture. They still owed loyalty. They still carried spears and axes. They still expected rewards. What changed was that the Lord now founded churches, employed bishops, and claimed to rule by the favor of the Christian God. Even the old language of heroic service could survive. Loyalty unto death remained admirable. Gift-giving remained political. Feasting continued. Poetry continued. The warrior ethos was not destroyed. It was rewritten inside Christian monarchy. But this created another problem. A society that restricted private raiding still contained ambitious young men trained to seek wealth through violence. The solution was not peace. It was to direct them toward new enemies and new employers. The most common path was also the least dramatic. Viking warriors became soldiers of Scandinavian states. Kings still needed fleets. Coastal geography made ships essential, and the older obligation known as the Lidangar developed into systems through which districts supplied vessels, crews, equipment, or taxes. Naval service did not disappear with Christianization. It became more closely supervised by rulers. A crew that once followed an independent chieftain in search of plunder might now sail under royal command. Its target could be a rival Scandinavian king, a rebellious province, or a foreign ruler against whom the king claimed lawful cause. Professional retainers also survived. The herd, a ruler's household following, preserved the personal relationship between lord and warrior. Members received gifts, status, protection, and opportunities. But Christian monarchy surrounded that relationship with court offices, written law, and religious ceremony. The warrior was no longer primarily a raider living at the edge of government. He increasingly became an instrument of government. This transformation can be seen in Knut the Great's empire before Stamford Bridge. Knut conquered England in 1016, but he ruled not as a pagan destroyer of churches. He became a major Christian monarch, patronized ecclesiastical institutions, and traveled to Rome. His Scandinavian and English retainers helped enforce a kingdom, connected to Denmark and, for periods, Norway. Knut's elite warriors are often associated with the housecarls, although historians debate the exact organization and permanence of this force. Whatever the institutional details, Scandinavian fighting men had clearly moved from seasonal raiding to salaried or rewarded service at a Christian royal court. By 1066, Harold Godwinson's own housecarls fought beneath the banner of a Christian English king using the long-handled Danish axe. At Hastings, men armed in a style associated with Scandinavian warfare defended England against Norman Christian knights. The weapon survived. The political identity around it had changed. Those who went east, for an ambitious Scandinavian warrior, the richest opportunities were sometimes found far from Scandinavia. Swedish and other northern travelers had long followed river systems through Eastern Europe. They traded, collected tribute, fought, and helped shape the political world of the Rus. The dynasty ruling Kiev claimed Scandinavian connections, but it quickly became embedded in Slavic society. Prince Vladimir of Kiev accepted Byzantine Christianity in 988. His conversion did not end the employment of northern warriors. It placed their service inside another Christian state. From Rus territories, Scandinavians continued south toward Constantinople. The Byzantine emperors recruited foreigners because outsiders could be personally dependent on the throne and less entangled in local aristocratic factions. The Varangian Guard became famous for Scandinavian personnel and later for English exiles. Runic inscriptions and memorial stones in Scandinavia preserve evidence of men who traveled to Greece, the Norse term commonly used for Byzantine lands. Families commemorated those who died abroad or returned wealthy. Byzantine coins, silk, weapons, and ornaments traveled north with them. Harold Hardrada was the most famous example, but not the only one. His career reveals that Christianization could expand rather than restrict a warrior's world. A Norwegian exile could serve the Rus, join an Orthodox emperor's forces, campaign in distant regions, accumulate wealth, and returned to claim a Christian throne. After 1066, Anglo-Saxon warriors, displaced by the Norman conquest, also entered Byzantine service. Their inclusion in the Varangian Guard shows how a northern military tradition could survive without a Viking political identity. Men still carried heavy axes and served through personal loyalty, but now they guarded an emperor in the heart of Christian civilization. They had not escaped history. They had found a new institution willing to purchase their skills. Those who became settlers, many so-called Viking warriors, had already ceased being Vikings generations before official conversion. In England, Scandinavian settlers occupied large areas of the north and east associated with the Danelaw. They farmed, married, traded, attended assemblies, and gradually entered English Christian society. place names and vocabulary, preserved their influence even as separate identities weakened. The process did not require the complete displacement of one population by another. Scandinavian newcomers lived among existing communities. Their descendants could possess both Norse and English names, follow local law, and worship in Christian churches. York illustrates the transformation. Once captured by Scandinavian forces, it became a major center of trade and political competition. Its population included craftspeople and merchants connected to the North Sea world. Christianity continued there under Scandinavian rule, the image of a purely pagan Viking city opposed to Christian England does not fit the evidence. Ireland produced another mixed society. Norse forces established coastal bases that developed into towns, including Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick. They fought Irish kingdoms, but also allied with them, intermarried, traded, and adopted elements of Gaelic culture. Dublin's rulers remained connected to the wider Norse world, yet the town became increasingly Christian. By the 11th century, it had a bishop. Norse Gaelic elites did not vanish after military defeats. They entered Ireland's shifting political order. In Normandy, the transformation was even more complete. In 911, the Frankish king, Charles the Simple, granted territory around Rouen to the Scandinavian leader, commonly known as Rollo, in return for loyalty and defense against further raiding. The precise terms and details are filtered through later sources, but the settlement's broad result is clear. Rollo's descendants adopted Christianity, the French language, and Frankish political customs. They married into the aristocracy and developed one of Europe's most formidable principalities. By 1066, William the Conqueror's army was not Viking in the ordinary sense. It fought with cavalry, used French, and sought papal approval. Yet Normandy had been created by the settlement and conversion of Scandinavian warriors. The descendants of raiders had become the disciplined Christian aristocracy that conquered England, expanded into southern Italy, and participated in the crusading movement. Assimilation was not extinction. It was one of the Vikings' greatest successes. Those who sought new frontiers. Some Scandinavians moved beyond the effective reach of the emerging monarchies. Iceland had been settled partly by people, escaping or avoiding the consolidation of royal power in Norway, though later traditions may exaggerate the role of a single royal tyranny. Its society preserved assemblies, feud culture, legal recitation, and strong chieftain families. After official conversion, Icelanders did not stop traveling or fighting. Some served foreign kings. Others took part in feuds at home. But Iceland's isolation allowed older stories and poetic traditions to survive. Christian scholars eventually wrote down material about the pagan past. The Poetic Edda and the sagas were preserved in Christian medieval Iceland. These texts are not transparent transcripts of Viking Age belief. They reflect oral traditions reshaped by later authors, literary aims, and Christian understanding. Still, without Christian Icelandic scribes, much of what the modern world knows about Odin, Thor, Ragnarok, and heroic legend might have disappeared. Greenland offered another frontier. Norse settlers established communities there from the late 10th century. They adopted Christianity, built churches, and maintained ties with Europe. The ruins at Valsey include a stone church, and written evidence records a wedding held there in 1408. Greenland's Norse settlements eventually disappeared for reasons still debated, including climate change, economic isolation, reduced trade, demographic vulnerability, and difficulty adapting to changing conditions. They were not pagan Viking refuges. They were remote Christian communities, descended from the expansion of the Viking Age. In the short term, the North Atlantic allowed warrior farmers to preserve independence. In the long term, even these distant settlements became connected to the church and the authority of Scandinavian crowns, those who continued raiding. Christianization did not bring an immediate end to Scandinavian aggression. Christian kings raided, invaded, and demanded tribute. They could justify campaigns through dynastic claims or political retaliation rather than pagan custom. The victims were often fellow Christians. Magnus Barefoot, king of Norway from 1093 to 1103, campaigned through the British Isles decades after Stamford Bridge. He intervened in the Hebrides, the Isle of Man, Ireland, and other regions linked to the Norse maritime world. He died in Ireland during a military expedition. Was Magnus a Viking? The answer depends on the definition. He was a Christian medieval king, leading overseas forces in pursuit of dominion. Yet his ships, targets, and warrior following continued practices recognizable from the Viking Age. The label faded before the behavior did. Danish expeditions continued in the Baltic. Scandinavian rulers fought Slavic peoples along the southern Baltic coast and competed for trade and territory. Raiding and conquest were gradually presented through Christian language, particularly when directed against non-Christian populations. By the 12th century, Scandinavian warriors participated in campaigns. Historians sometimes call the Northern Crusades. The older logic of expansion was now joined to papal authorization, conversion, and church building. A warrior could still cross the sea, attack a foreign settlement, seize territory, and return with prestige. The crucial difference was that he might carry a cross, attend mass, and describe the enemy as pagan. Christianity did not extinguish Scandinavian militarism. It gave it a new moral vocabulary. Those who resisted or concealed the old religion. Open resistance to Christianity is difficult to reconstruct because the surviving written sources were mostly produced by Christians. Later sagas describe pagan loyalists who refused baptism, destroyed churches, or challenged missionary kings. Some individuals may be historical, but speeches, tortures, supernatural contests, and dramatic conversions often reflect literary construction. Archaeology provides a quieter record. Thor's hammer amulets became especially visible during the conversion period, perhaps as deliberate responses to the Christian cross. Some graves combined Christian orientation with objects rooted in older custom. Runestones could use Christian symbols while preserving pre-Christian artistic forms. This suggests that identities overlapped. A warrior might accept baptism for political reasons while continuing to value ancestral rituals. Another might reinterpret Thor as a cultural protector rather than publicly worship him. Families could retain stories, names, feast customs, and magical practices after sacrifice was outlawed. The older gods survived longest where royal and ecclesiastical control remained weak. But without public temples, recognized priests, or powerful patrons, the religion could not reproduce itself in the same institutional form as the church. Pagan resistance therefore faced an unequal contest. Christianity had bishops, foreign alliances, royal laws, literacy, property, and permanent buildings. The old religion had local memory and practice, but no single scripture, hierarchy, or united organization. Over generations, concealment became folklore. Odin survived in stories. Thor survived in names and legends. Older supernatural beings were recast as demons, giants, trolls, ancestors, or dangerous spirits. The pagan warrior did not necessarily make one final confession and disappear. His grandchildren simply inherited a different explanation for the customs he had left them. Those who became pilgrims and crusaders. The most striking reversal occurred when descendants of Viking warriors traveled not to plunder Christian sanctuaries but to pray at them. Scandinavians undertook pilgrimages to Rome and Jerusalem. Kings used pilgrimage to demonstrate devotion, gain prestige, and connect their realms to Latin Christendom. Warriors accompanied them as guards and followers. The transformation did not eliminate the attraction of distant travel. It redirected it. The same maritime experience that had carried raiders to monasteries could transport pilgrims, merchants, and crusaders. Sigurd I of Norway, later called Sigurd the Crusader, left with a fleet around 1107 and traveled through the western Mediterranean to the Holy Land. He assisted the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem in the capture of Sidon in 1110 before returning to Norway. His expedition retained recognizable elements of Viking kingship. Ships, a royal following, overseas battle, reputation, and treasure. But its destination and legitimacy were Christian. Sigurd presented himself not as an outsider attacking Europe, but as a defender of a faith to which Scandinavia now belonged. Within roughly 3 centuries, Scandinavians had moved from attacking the monastery at Lindisfarne to campaigning in support of Jerusalem's Christian rulers. That was not the disappearance of the warrior. It was his admission into medieval medieval Europe. Transformation and legacy. The Viking warriors did not perish as a class because no permanent Viking class had ever existed. Their old ecosystem dissolved. Independent chieftains lost ground to kings. Seasonal raiding became harder as European states improved defenses. Christian law restricted attacks on churches and fellow Christians. Royal taxation and military obligation replaced some of the profit-driven expedition system. Bishops and written administration helped monarchs extend authority into local communities. The survivors adapted because their skills remained valuable. Seamanship became royal naval service. Personal loyalty became service in a court or military household. Overseas ambition led to Byzantium, the Rus territories, Ireland, the North Atlantic, or the Mediterranean. Settlement transformed foreign warriors into local landholders. Raiding could be recast as conquest, dynastic war, or crusade. Even the symbols changed gradually. The longship did not disappear when its crew was baptized. The sword did not become obsolete because a cross appeared on its hilt. The skald could praise a Christian, king using poetic techniques inherited from the pagan past. What disappeared was the political legitimacy of remaining outside Christian monarchy. Popular mythology often presents the conversion as a contest between fearless pagan freedom and oppressive Christian civilization. The historical reality is less simple. Christianity could be coercive, especially when kings used conversion to destroy rival centers of authority. People were threatened, exiled, or killed, but many Scandinavians also adopted Christianity voluntarily or pragmatically. The faith connected merchants to foreign markets, rulers to diplomatic networks, and communities to institutions that offered literacy, education, legal organization, and international status. Nor was the Viking Age ended by religion alone. Stronger kingdoms, changing trade patterns, urbanization, military defenses, internal state formation, and the integration of Scandinavia into European politics all mattered. Christianization both accelerated and expressed those changes. The Romantic Viking is also misleading. Later nationalism, literature, opera, archaeology, and modern entertainment transformed a diverse historical population into a single warrior race. The horned helmet, one of the most recognizable images, was not standard Viking battle equipment. The idea of every dead warrior feasting in Valhalla reduces a complex religious world to one dramatic destination. Yet the mythology survives because conversion preserved as well as destroyed. Christian Icelanders recorded the poetry and stories through which the pagan gods are now known. Christian kings raised rune stones using an older script and artistic vocabulary. Churches were built near earlier sacred places. Medieval Scandinavian law absorbed customs that had existed before conversion. The Normans carried Scandinavian ancestry into England, Italy, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Norse settlers shaped language and place names in Britain and Ireland. The Rus and Varangian worlds connected Scandinavia to Eastern Europe and Byzantium. Scandinavian kingdoms that emerged from the transformation, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, survived long after the raiding age ended. The final irony is that conversion did not make the North less influential. It made Scandinavian rulers recognized participants in the system they had once attacked from the outside. The Viking warrior vanished only when people stopped understanding his expedition as a distinct Viking act. By then, his descendants were knights, royal guards, townsmen, landowners, pilgrims, mercenaries, and crusaders. They were still traveling, fighting, trading, and conquering. They were simply doing it under different names. So what happened to the Viking warriors after Europe became Christian? They were not exterminated, collectively disarmed, or forced into obscurity. Europe had been predominantly Christian during much of the Viking Age. The decisive change came when Scandinavia itself entered Christian political society. Some warriors died resisting royal centralization. Some concealed older beliefs. Many returned to farms or settled permanently among the populations their ancestors had once raided. Others served Christian kings, guarded Byzantine emperors, built Norman lordships, or carried their weapons into crusading armies. Their disappearance was therefore a transformation of identity. not a disappearance of people. The Viking Age ended when independent maritime violence was absorbed into kingdoms, churches, laws, and professional armies. The old warrior survived, but the world no longer called him a Viking. Which vanished warrior society should we follow beyond its final battle next? Subscribe to After the Sword for more stories about what happened after the banners fell and the surviving warriors had to find a place in a changed world.